The age of digital sovereignty is upon us, and thank you, Mike, for the opportunity to talk on this BOB conference about digital sovereignty, which is a topic that I've been pondering for more than 5 years when it became, kind of had its first major breakthrough. Mostly this has been from a perspective from within the public administration, where this has become kind of a go-to phrase, centaur, and mostly this has been from the perspective of trying to figure out what is actually meant when people use that term. And whether this is more like a dance around the golden calf, as depicted here in this painting by Claude Lorraine from 1660. The term is, of course, much younger than 1660. It first appeared in the literature around in the early 2010s and enjoyed a rapid rise, especially around 2015, where it seeped more and more into the political discourse. It was also around this time that the German Bitkom Association first published a paper, screenshot on the right-hand side, where they described digital sovereignty as a goal that was increasingly being defined in the policy sphere without any clear understanding what is actually meant with digital sovereignty. So it was a goal that everybody was striving towards, but nobody could exactly say what actually is political sovereignty or how that goal could be achieved. At the time, Bitkom proposed a spectrum with external control. Others decide what we're doing, and complete self-sufficiency. We're doing everything by ourselves as kind of the extremes of the spectrum. Both are not to be desired goals. And in the middle, there's a definition of sovereignty as the ability or competence to act and make informed decisions in the center. But the deeper I delved into this question about what this actually means, the more questions arose for me. If the very definition of sovereignty by Bitkom could be expressed as competency, why use a different term in the first place? Even the question of who should be sovereign from whom can be answered in many different and sometimes contradictory ways. Suddenly everything was kind of sovereign, and everybody claimed that their products or their approaches could be sovereign. Some harkened back to the times of the Treaty of Westphalia as depicted here. And there were suddenly discussions about the right or orthodox way of how sovereignty is to be defined. At times, the discourse seemed to be focused more on the correct kind of interpretation, the right course of action, with disputes about the right kind of interpretation being exchanged through kinds of open letters that were mailed to, for example, the president of the BSE in Germany, kind of akin to nailing their thesis to the wall of the Wittenberg Church here. So what is the orthodox alternative to the false prophets product to date? How are orthodoxy and heterodoxy being defined in the first place? And what is to do if the false prophets turn out to be ultimately even more digitally sovereign than we, as the righteous prophets, are ourselves? What I find completely lacking in all this discourse, and still find mostly lacking in this discourse, however, is the question of what a practical, actionable plan for establishing the competencies for evaluating and decision-making in the digital realm, as they had been proposed by Bitkom in 2015, could actually look like. And I'm now convinced more than ever that we will not get any closer to this goal as long as we continue to dance around the metaphorical golden calf instead of actually defining what our concrete and actionable goals are. Bearing in mind the ever-increasing popularity of the term, it kind of peaked last year with discussions around, maybe some of you have followed the discussions about the kind of mythical Deutschland stack that is supposed to bring Germany kicking and screaming into the 21st century after 26 years. This seems to be like a bold hypothesis. Therefore, I would like to justify it with 3 arguments. First, an arbitrary term and thinking in borders. Critical questions about what the term actually could mean are not new. Theodore Christakis has analyzed the different interpretations of the term in EU strategies in a 100-page paper. He repeatedly uses the words buzzword and projection surface and begins his introduction with the following quote from Louis Henkin from 1995. Sovereignty is often a catchword, a substitute for thinking and precision. Delving deeper into that quote would be worthwhile in itself, but entering into a fundamental critique of the concept of sovereignty itself is not the point here. And it's not even necessary, because in 2019, Couture and Dupont took another closer look at the context in which digital sovereignty was used in publications and identified 5 different classes, 5 different religious flavor, so to say, of this kind of interpretation. The first one was cyberspace sovereignty. Found, for instance, in the Libertarian Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace from 1996, the internet is a specific place, a specific space outside previous ideas of governmental sovereignty and influences. States and their national borders are not even supposed to play any role anymore. The internet is to be left alone. It's a separate entity that's not subject to the old structures and laws. Secondly, and diametrically opposed to this first idea, an approach based on this very idea of nation-states enacting their rules. States and their authorities define goals on how the digital realm is supposed to be from their perspective, and used a classical sovereignty as a state after the Westphalian model. This often includes notions of keeping infrastructure or data flows within certain jurisdiction through which somehow sovereignty is to be achieved. Thirdly, indigenous digital sovereignty as part of the larger struggle of indigenous people to regain sovereignty over their language, culture, land, and bodies. This is also in contrast to the idea of nation-state sovereignty, and is worth noting and pointing out that the country is currently claiming to facilitate sovereignty through establishing their own infrastructure or data centers or data flows, etc., are mostly the very countries that have in the past robbed indigenous people of their sovereignty and autonomy. Fourthly, social movements and their role in society. From this point of view, design and decisions in the digital sphere are not defined solely by government agencies or government actors, or to be located within a certain geopolitical sphere of influence, but rather involve transnational collaborative development. From the free software movement to the establishment of community-built and maintained communication networks, those who are able to and have the time to do so jointly build and maintain and operate infrastructures for the benefit of all as a shared commons. And lastly, personal sovereignty. Being able to master one's digital devices and to adapt and control them to one's personal liking. This could supplement and broaden the previous idea of collective care for the digital realms and digital commons, but it could also mean a retreat into the private sphere, into, well, just caring for oneself and for one's personal devices and not caring for the broader collective. This is ranking individual freedoms rank higher than collective efforts. Couture and Dupont also point out the connection to ideas of bodily autonomy in the context of feminist discourses. This already demonstrates the enormous breadth of interpretation of the term, with the various approaches sometimes being diametrically opposed and having very contrasting goals and consequences, which led me to kind of this reaction. On the one hand, we have an interpretation that is quite similar to the one of Bitkom 11 years ago, but on a global, collaborative level that creates common good for all and promotes the ideas of digital commons worldwide through a division of labor. Or one on a highly individual level, where individuals have intimate control over their devices in a way that prevents even the authorities of a sovereign state to access these devices or the information on them, even if this very access were legally mandated on the basis of that state's, well, sovereignty in the classical sense. Juxtapose this with the interpretation of digital sovereignty requiring that government agencies can enforce their legal frameworks within the spheres of the digital, in some cases even extending into the actual geographic spheres of influence of other sovereign states, as is the case with the GDPR that is supposed to take effect even outside the European Union. In some cases, this goal is to be achieved by requiring data centers to be physically located within the country's own territory and ensuring that information flows do not cross territorial borders. This is somewhat reminiscent of stories from IT law, especially in government contexts, where projects are being run on a server on-premise, preferably in maybe some storage closet in the actual town hall or government building, thereby making the platform or whatever runs on it blessed and orthodox and, of course, sovereign. scare quotes to be inserted here. Apart from the fact that this way of thinking simultaneously reinforces the idea of an inner us, so that's the good ones, and the outer others, the not so good ones coming from outside the country's borders, and that the stated goals of regaining controls do not rhyme with the slogans surrounding Brexit and other movements like it by accident, even if one ignores all of this nationalistic thinking and how it just doesn't match the cross-national way on how, for example, free software is being built. There remain two glaring flaws in this approach. A, how does building competency actually look like? And B, how do we deal with power dynamics? What good is a sovereign public data platform that runs on a machine in the mayor's storage closet when each and any improvement and patch installation can only be facilitated through some external vendor? How does it lead to building the competency and capacity on a management level to be able to evaluate possible approaches and choose the path that is most promising in the long run? Does it actually help to just substitute the MS Office suite with tool discussion incoming LibreOffice or only Office or some flavor of Nextcloud interjection? No, it doesn't. Office formats are the bane of reusable data, and their use should be contained, and we should all use Markdown because this allows us the next big shift. Away with the fax machines, the future lies in data that can be transmitted through teletype machines. Digressive rant off. Functional programming is kind of I was too stupid for it during my studies, but I love the idea of structured data that can be evaluated through rules of logic. That's what AI was cool back when it was not cool, and it was not when it was not agentic stuff that deletes your emails. But seriously, how do we go about creating tangible visions for a digital future that think not in what is currently en vogue and fancy and hip, mold book or whatever, but what is sensible and purposeful? How can we make this more than just exchanging the dependencies from supposedly bad, foreign, big tech companies with dependency from supposedly good, because they are European, not so big tech vendors? What does the desired end state of digital sovereignty look like? And what does that mean in concrete terms? And how does the path to there look like? This raised big questions for me. Back when I still worked in the public sector, I saw a huge discrepancy between the demands for sovereignty and the actual reality in the metaphorical engine room of the public administration. And somehow these two just did not fit together. Until I came across the second argument as to why the term could actually stand in the way of the goal, that is logomachy and magic concepts. That is to say that the ambiguity and freedom to reinterpret the meaning of digital sovereignty could also be intentional and deliberate. Simon Wardley summed it up succinctly in 2020 when one could still be on Twitter. The gameplay of digital sovereignty in the West is mostly crap. We don't use maps, we don't use stories, and have endless blah blah sessions of consultants trying to define digital sovereignty. It's like generals trying to win a war by giving it the right and proper name. And I love that sentiment. If one assumes that it is not so much about a specific meaning, but rather about using the correct orthodox term, the discourse takes on a whole new dimension. Logomachy, the battle for theologically correct power words, is central to the world of government and bureaucracy. That is the opening statement. Now I can prove, by the way, now I can prove that I did not just invent this religious setting and the religious context, which I framed this all in. This is the quote that introduces the journal article talking about government, in which the authors describe the role of magic concept. That is, concepts that are widespread and fashionable in politics and governments, and probably also management circles, which promote the impression of progressiveness, but which also contribute to diluting the discourse and distracting from the actual important decisions. The authors identify four characteristics. Why did I? The slide is correct. 4 characteristics of what makes a magic concept. First is broadness. A magic concept covers broad domains, has multiple, sometimes overlapping, sometimes conflicting definitions. They connect to many other concepts, have large scope and high valency. Secondly, normative attractiveness. A magic concept has an overwhelmingly positive connotation. It is hard to argue against sovereignty, at least without at least a 5-minute explainer beforehand. It is bound to modernity and progressiveness and often proposed to replace something that is now supposedly out of date. While one can argue both for centralization and decentralization, each has their benefits and their drawbacks in certain contexts. Depending on context, therefore allowing for cases where each of both approaches is valid, there is hardly ever the case for some opposite of a magic concept. A magical concept therefore conveys 3, the impression of consensus, that everybody agrees, at least on broad terms, on what it means, apart from the occasional schisms over the truly correct and orthodox interpretation. However, this dilutes the problem that different and conflicting interests and logics need to be analyzed and weighed up. Examples by the authors are democracy versus efficiency or profit interests versus public benefit, all of which play a subordinate role or no role at all in the context of the magical concept. And finally, the magic concept is used by many researchers and practitioners. It is en vogue, just like generative AI right now. It is often used in official documents, in the titles of reform projects and new institutes or institutions in both the academic and governmental sectors. The concept is the subject of conferences, seminars, and the title of publications, or even keynotes at the Bob conference. When it comes to the concept of digital sovereignty, I see 4 ticks for the 4 characteristics described here. This is not to say that the magical concept is necessarily a bad thing. Precisely because of their properties, they are suitable for mobilizing people, attracting attention and doing things that are actually meaningful, which only become acceptable to the majority and gain approval because of the magic concept. Pollitt and Juppe, the authors, also describe how they can be used both for good and bad purposes. However, there's a risk that I have attempted to illustrate here. It's only in the movies that the good side actually prevails in the end. It could well be true that using the term to promote one's goals and one's agenda can be kind of used in a judo move against you, again from more powerful actors who try to peddle their interpretation of what this actually means in this to their advantage. However, once such terms have played out their advantages, they very quickly reach their limits anyway. It is precisely their abstract nature and the associated constant reinterpretability. I'm not a native English speaker. Reinterpretability. The discussions about the correct definition that tempt us to engage in this kind of scam battles instead of clearly defining the actual goals we want to achieve and making the path to them comprehensible. The article on magical concepts concludes with the sentence, "Magic is entertaining, it excites discussion, but when the show is over, many hard choices remain." And that brings me to my 3rd argument. If digital sovereignty is too abstract, too open to arbitrary interpretations, how can we better describe where we actually want to go? I find it an amusing concept or exercise in discussions, such as those here today, to play a kind of taboo game. Describe what you actually mean, but without actually using digital sovereignty as a chiffre what you mean, as an exercise in analyzing and defining the problem as precisely as possible. This is an approach that, in my opinion, can hold significant power, but which, for this very reason, must be used with caution with leadership circles, where pointing out inconsistencies can, at times, be interpreted as challenging established power structures within an organization. Such structures have rules of their own that are not always easily accessible or understandable if one comes from a working class background or is neurospicy or both. The English language, for example, has the wonderful word folly that can be translated into other languages to the term foolishness, but which also identify some kind of class of ornamental garden building that people connected with foolishness. This popular recontextualization notwithstanding, rich and powerful people in the 18th century spent considerable sums to have intricate, large, often eccentric constructions built in their grand and lavish gardens that were decorative and often were not meant to serve any actual purpose, or the purpose was completely out of proportion to the design and size and style of the building. But here's the important part to keep in mind. Anybody pointing out the uselessness of having a sham medieval castle in one's garden is missing the point. They were not built despite being much more expensive than practical, but because they were, because this was a way for rich, powerful noblemen to display their wealth among each other. The opinions of the common folk were of no consequence and to be disregarded, and it pays to keep the power dynamics and structures in mind. For example, other than I had long assumed from memory, the fairy tale of the emperor's new clothes does not end with everybody realizing that the emperor is naked, but everybody pretending that they are all well clad and the sovereign imperial clothing industry is to be supported because this overlapped with the interests of everybody involved. Terry Pratchett put it like this: the story of the emperor's new clothes could also be subsumed with the child who was who did not know their place and got a thrashing when they got home for disrespecting power. Why does this display? There we are. It might therefore be sensible not to engage in further attempts to litigate the term and what it's supposed to mean, but to jointly as a collective come up with terms that describe what we would actually like to have as an outcome. In German, it's possible to use souverän to describe that somebody has really mastered an instrument or sport or driving a vehicle, or that they are an architect that has mastered their domain. In the realm of the digital, we are often confronted with the problem that there are many people within our profession that have mastered their trade. They know both from their training and their practical experience what models and patterns have worked in the past, and sometimes even more importantly, which ones haven't. The knowledge about those patterns are there, they are just not evenly distributed. And part of that problem might be a translation gap that makes these experiences more accessible to leadership positions without falling for shorthands that can be used against one the moment some metaphoric Ferengi lay their hand on it. My wish and my plea is therefore to abandon the concept of digital sovereignty without further ado, to try to describe precisely what is meant by it and how to achieve competency and the ability to choose the right way, the far-sighted path forward, and to always demand the same clarity in terms and expressions from others. I'm now looking forward very much to discussions about my bold thesis, or for you to, I don't know, what's beschimpfen in English, to strongly disagree with me.
Well, first of all, thank you, Stefan. Any questions or disagreements? There?
Yeah, so I'm actually tasked at the moment with digital sovereignty at my company. It's become a priority all of a sudden. Now, one thing I'd say that slightly disagrees with you is actually the way that's couched to me is very specifically in terms of mitigations of very specific risks to do with generally the ability to make money or operate systems that bring money in. However, something you say there is very important, right? So actually understanding this question more broadly is something that's missing. The motivations aren't there. So on the one hand, while cloud, for example, right now, cloud location, ownership, management, risk of loss of control for American corporations, very much on the table. At the same time, the same people who want this are as eager as ever to give away control in pursuit of the shiny new objects of AI. So how do we couch that discussion so that we can see these are the same topic?
Shall I repeat the question for the recording? Yes. Yeah, okay. So your question is, you are tasked with this very concept of attaining digital sovereignty in your company, I suppose?
Yes.
Where this has come up all of a sudden for no reasons related to anything happening right now. And you see the discrepancy between, on the one hand, trying to reduce dependencies on cloud services, for example, on the other hand, a kind of willingness from leadership to jump up upon the next kind of thing that would create such dependencies. Yeah. Well, that's leadership, isn't it? Sometimes. I think this framing as dependency management is a good one. To say what are the foundations that our processes are built upon, what kind of Jenga blocks are there underlying our principles, and how have they worked quite well in the past for us? It was easy to, I don't know what your systems were that were in place, and how could they be pulled from under us? It's kind of like, I don't know, the whole industry has been based on kind of a rent extracting scheme, in my opinion, and in some places it makes sense. Anybody who runs server infrastructure on bare metal, not as a hobby but as a profession, knows how this can land you flat on the nose, and there are scaling opportunities to do this all scaling as well. Yep. On the other hand, I think one important task could be to reframe the discussion in this very dependency management problem. So framing or trying to reframe proposals to use shiny new tool ABC because everybody else is doing it. Everybody's building follies, why don't we? In a bookkeeping sense, to put this on the books. So what are our long-term obligations, and what's the cost of migrating on short notice if something bad happens? So always have contingency plans on the books, and maybe even have management sketch out budget allocations for that. So make them feel what it's like to have reserves, to having to have reserves in case anything bad happens from some other vendor, even if that other vendor happens to be from the righteous ones from, I don't know, T-Systems, which is in Europe, which is of course a good actor now, isn't it? So that could be an approach. I'm very interested in exchanging the ways and the methods and the approaches you all have taken so far. Maybe this could be a topic for some kind of, I don't know, roundtable discussion where we can exchange strategies and what kind of language works that translates this gap to a management level.
Thank you.
So this last slide seems to be picking back and looping back to the start about definition, picking definition, and other thing that says demand. Like the only entity we could demand something from is government, and the whole talk kind of looks like based on the government should be dealing with it. Like, did you consider possibilities that government has no business dealing with any of these things?
Mm-hmm.
And like private businesses can make all the bets and all the decisions because they spend their own money. The government spends our money,
Yeah.
and like it's not part of their responsibilities to change this like today seems.
Okay. Why is the screen blanking? Just when you were referring to the slide. No, this is talking about competency, right? The question was, this slide looked to you like looping back to the definition game at the beginning, and what role government has in it.
It says demand, and demand, we can demand.
Oh yeah, demanding clarity. Okay, I see your point. Demanding clarity, what's to be the demand of the government, and the government spends our public money, and private companies can do what they like. Demanding clarity, I mean this in the sense of demanding clarity wherever you encounter the term. Not only vis-a-vis the government, but also vis-a-vis your structures where you work, where somebody brings up the term, to make clear what is it actually that you mean. Do you mean dependency management? Do you mean supply chain? Do you mean bill of material stuff, anything like that? What do you actually mean? In terms of government, I think it's important to not have government always totally rely on the private sector. The picture in the back is not chosen by accident. That's the sewage system in the city of Cologne that was built over 100 years ago by the government for the people, and they included this kind of representative hall in the sewage system. It's called the Kronleuchtersaal in Cologne. This was meant for a public reception of the Kaiser back then, because they wanted to show what good public infrastructure works they were building for the citizens from the hard-spent money of the citizens. And that's another way of thinking about infrastructure. I'm not proposing that the state build everything their own. On the spectrum from Bitkom, we're doing everything by ourselves. And the other extreme would be to be totally dependent from external factors. Right now, I see the state mostly on that scale, on the being totally dependent from others sense. And the proposed goal by Bitkom 11 years ago was to build competencies. You do not need to be able to build a house. No, let's phrase it differently. I'm not proposing that the government build their metaphorical house all by themselves. Nobody wants a world in which the public administration runs all the official servers. This would be interesting. Interesting times coming up. But if there was not everything was bad with Bundesbahn. It tied together with Bundespost, for example. Now we don't have that. We have postal distribution centers out in the sticks where everything works by truck. So there are. Let's not digress. Rabbit holes upon rabbit holes. But if you do have the competency to know how a metaphorical house is built, you do realize what you yourself need, and you realize when your contractors try to screw you over. So having the competency allows you to make more informed and better decisions. There's a book from 2010, it's called Better for Less, it's from the UK. It's kind of a libertarian approach sometimes, or liberal approach, but they very clearly defined you have to know what you're aiming for. Right now the situation in the public sector is mostly they do have to tender a consultant so that this consultant writes the requirements for another consultant to actually do the job for the administration. And to actually do at least the basics as kind of as far as requirements engineering is concerned, that's a competency that has to be built. And here demanding clarity within your corporations, within your companies, within your work context, but also vis-a-vis government, this can help kind of circumnavigating talking about just facades, but the very foundations we're talking about.
Yes. Thank you. Manuel?
Yeah, so I sense a conflict in the last slide and something you told us earlier in your talk. The conflict is that in the end you said, well, let's don't use terms like digital sovereignty because of all the disadvantages which are correct, which you mentioned. But on the other hand, you also said these magic words, they actually serve a very good purpose, a very good political purpose, namely mobilizing people. And if we believe in democracy and grassroots politics, then that's absolutely super important. If you can't mobilize your base, you will not achieve any political goals. Now, I agree, digital sovereignty is not a very good term. Actually, I prefer digital autonomy, which is arguably maybe a bit better, but at least you can easily explain it in simple examples, like when a judge from the International Criminal Court is sanctioned by another government's head and is unable to fulfill their function anymore, then that's a problem, and it certainly means the court isn't able to function autonomously, which for a court, which needs to be independent from the other two powers, is of course inherently undemocratic and dangerous. So now, to turn this into a question, how there's this tension, right? We need magic words to mobilize our political base, but on the other hand, these big words, they lead to consultancies, circle jerking, which we don't want. So what's your answer to this this conflict, this tension?
Okay, first the challenge of rephrasing that question for the recording. You found a discrepancy maybe between my proposed not using that term and the political power of using magical concepts to rally and to mobilize. And you propose digital autonomy as a different expression, and had the example of the European Court that was cut off by Microsoft, I suppose.
Well, by Trump, via Microsoft.
Via Microsoft, they were cut off from their Microsoft infrastructure. And how to reconcile this. I think, first of all, I think autonomy is similarly a magical concept, because on the scale it's kind of more like the Juche way, like the North Korea way. We are completely self-sufficient, we don't need others. That's autonomy in a sense, so it can be interpreted as such. I do see the power of magic concepts. As I outlined in the slides, the problem is this tool can be used by and for and against anything. By anybody and for against anything. And I like to monkey paw proposals. You probably know the story of the monkey's paw. It grants you 3 wishes and fulfills the wishes in the worst way possible. Sticking to the literal wish that you propose, but it's always the worst way possible. And I like this exercise because it's kind of my, I'm from a disaster prevention background as well, so everything that can go wrong might go wrong. And it's good to be prepared for that thing. So I see the attractiveness of the term, but it kind of dilutes the messaging, and you cannot keep the messaging in your hand and keep it in the way that you want it to go. What I've seen in public discourse is mostly that when such ideas take traction, it goes into the right direction at first, and then all of a sudden it makes a 90-degree turn and runs into the nearest wall. Because somebody has found out that they can make quite a lot of money from government contracts, for example, and do it in a way that's maybe not coherent with your goals. As far as the European Court goes, I mean, the Ursünde, the basic fallacy was to rely as a court on Microsoft Office, and I repeat, Office should be contained and not be used in any context, and we should all switch to Markdown and structured data. Which is interesting in a legal sense, for example. Where are the URIs for stable definitions of laws, for example? I digress again. Autonomy in this sense could be an option, but mostly it's again about supply chain management, about being able to switch between vendors and not having lock-in effects. And you can describe not having lock-in effects without using digital sovereignty. A lock-in effect is something that is very clear and is quite precise and can be proposed as a problem, and alternatives to this problem can be proposed without using the shorthand. So whenever the occasion arises that you are talking about specific examples, I would argue for using those specific examples and maybe getting into the door with the magic concept. That can be argued for, but as soon as you are inside the door, being as precise and as specific as you can. That's my argument right now. We see this right now also with open source versus free software. We're seeing open source being promoted as tenders, but the end product not being a common good that is being shared by share-like licenses, and the state who has paid for that product losing the autonomy over that software product as well. So it's rabbit holes all the way down.
We'll start here.
Thank you. First, I want to support Manuel's view that autonomy is a good concept. It's belongs to the most clearly defined concepts ever. Immanuel Kant did that long time ago. Very core concept of philosophical concept, which I think is exactly what we mean. Second thing, try to turn an observation into a question. You say we abandon that concept because two strands. The one is that it's unclear who's the subject of autonomy, and secondly, it's totally unclear what actions or strategies would bring about sovereignty. And then also, adding up to Manuel's, when we abandon the concept, we should try to come up with a proposition what would substitute it, because we need a language for that, and this is really also core of what he said. we need some language for it. So which language would substitute that?
Yeah. You pointed out yourself that autonomy also includes the question who is autonomous from whom and so on and so forth, and how can those definitions conflict and contrast with each other. And asking about what to replace that with, I would start with what kind of problem analysis. Go into the domain that you're analyzing. Go into where the problems are, for example, with the international court, with their dependency on certain products that can be switched off at any moment. This could also happen with, I don't know, some other vendor within Europe, for example. We are not as stable. The European Union is not a coherently stable democracy. There are some countries which are less democratic and less, well, stabil, as one says in German, as others. And so that could happen within Europe as well. But analyzing what the problems actually are and then coming up with what to do with this very specific problem, that would be the language I'd propose. Of course, this is complex, and magic concepts reduce complexity down to one simple seeming term. But and I think that's the main issue here, to analyze what has to be done. Sid Harrell used to work with 18F in the USA, and in her book she said her job was to showing what's possible and then doing what's necessary. And I really like that, because it says analyzing a problem, showing how it can be solved in a prototype, whatever, and then doing the hard work, the infrastructure work, building stuff that lasts for long times and not as a hot fix. And do that for every problem individually, specifically, maybe use an umbrella term to gain momentum, but when it comes to actually fulfilling stuff, not relying on the shorthand, but being as clear and as precise as possible, lest you get your tool taken away from you by some other person who might not have the insight, but is a better salesperson and has the ability to sell the fine magic cloths to the metaphorical emperor.
Yeah, so you proposed yourself that it could be just an umbrella term.
It could be an umbrella term. It's just keep in mind the ways in which it can be perverted and used against you. It's a magic. It's a powerful stuff, and powerful stuff comes with caution.
Disaster prevention.
So we'll do 3 more, the hands that I see now. So I'm going to start at the back.
Okay, that's for me.
Yeah.
For me again, an observation you mentioned a while ago, libertarianism. So I work in the private sector, but also our leaders in many countries in Europe, including Germany, I think are more prone to listening to the private sector than they are to the public sector. There's a debate here, and you mentioned libertarianism. The people who lead key companies, who I would say ascribe sometimes to those beliefs, they like to talk about themselves in terms of, for example, something I work for is an investment space. I talk about what they're doing in terms of encouraging personal freedom, individuals gaining the right to control their finances. So I think there's an opportunity there. You know, they're not driven by nationalism. They see digital sovereignty as a reaction to the threat of nationalism. There's an opportunity in what we're saying to raise the level of debate there, bring those people into that discussion and talk to them about this broader topic. And it might be actually that we need to have these magic words in order to get that forum and that place at that table to talk about it.
Yes, I'm at a loss now how to subsume this for the recording. I try to do it as a kind of an answer. I'm with you that the magical concepts can help to shift the discourse away, and one is to keep in mind that the political discourse is very much influenced by the private sector, who's got the money to, well, insert their views into the political realm. But this could also be an opportunity for us to introduce other terms that kind of steer that have the capacity to steer that discussion. If you're talking about, for example, again, open source versus free software, and keep in mind that this is infrastructure that is built by public resources for the public, we are faced with a choice where we can invest money and then have privatized roads and privatized sewer infrastructure that is not in the hands of the people, more or less, Or we can choose to build this as a commons that is being used by and for everybody. And that's the small differences. And of course, it's tedious to recycle those old discussions, for example, about free software versus open source software. But I think it's necessary. And if just as an exercise for yourself to kind of lift the fog of war, and again speaking in disaster prevention terms, to have a clear understanding of the map and of the landscape that we are in, and what are the other factors that pull into a discussion, and which, if we do not have them on our screen and in our understanding of the map, might lead us into directions that we did not foresee.
Would you agree that there is a sort of parallel between this digital sovereignty or autonomy discussion and the discussions about safety and security? Because I couldn't help but think that in this other domain you also often see this magical thinking where the terms are not so precisely backed by a threat analysis or risk analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Very much, or the terms are even conflated because in German both safety and security translate to the same word.
Yeah. So the parallels between safety and security versus sovereignty and autonomy and so on, probably yes, and I think I like that that suggestion, because it makes you think about how you go about dealing with the problem. Is your problem outcome oriented, or are you compliance oriented? Is it about having checklists that you can make? I mean, it is possible for you to have an ISO 9001 certified enterprise that makes flotation devices from concrete. That is perfectly possible. It's not useful, but it's possible. So that's the difference. Are you outcome oriented? What's your goal? Or is it about making check marks? Thanks for that addition.
One more?
Yeah, I have some ideas why this thing keeps being so unclear. First, so let's start what this is from the point of view of IT security. This is A from the CIA, the availability, I would say. Now, if you look at security, it depends who the actor is. My security can be your annoyance, his costs. That's why it becomes so unclear, because who is sovereign here? In my case, Apple can take my Apple ID. Then I lose, I don't know, let's say I'm stupid. Then I lose access to my payment device because of Apple Pay. I lose access to my passwords because I was stupid to store my passwords in the cloud. I lose my email accounts, which triggers a cascade that brings me out of my bank account, and so forth, and I'm out of everything. This is my sovereignty. I want to own that infrastructure. From the point of view of Apple, they are sovereign, so it's interest. So that's why I wouldn't say the state or who. It's everyone who is a legal person, be it company or person. They should look at what infrastructure they own. Of course, it's not possible, it's too expensive. I think it's as simple as that. Look at owning my infrastructure.
That's pretty much what I went with the implication of broad consensus. People talk about the term and they think they are aligned. But that's just because the reduction of complexity leads to a less clear map of the metaphorical realm we're in right now and the metaphorical space we're discussing. So as long as this, it's kind of like a fuzzy, unclear picture. As long as the picture is unclear and fuzzy, we can assume, or we are under the impression that we're talking about the same thing and that we have consensus that we all want that. As soon as the picture gets sharper, as soon as the details come up, we see the points where we are on conflicting points of views, where they are diametrically opposed, and the conflicts that can arise become more clear and become discussable. That's why I propose, maybe just as an exercise to get internal clarity, to kind of leave the term lying at the wayside for a moment, and trying to define the map as clearly as possible without going to the shorthand, and then maybe using it as a political metaphor to put your points across, but by then you know more clearly what it is actually what you want to what you're trying to achieve, and more importantly, what it is that you want the discussion not to go towards to.
All right. Thank you so much, Stefan.